Welcome to I See What You Mean, a podcast about how people get on the same page or don't, or perhaps shouldn't. Today my guest is Dan Morford. Dan's a friend, colleague, fellow foodie, blues and rum fan, and a father worried as I am about our democracy and country. Dan, welcome to the show.
Well, thank you, Lou. It's glad to be here. I guess we want to talk about the political landscape of today, huh?
Yeah, you and I talk about that all the time, and yes, I think it'd make a great podcast episode. To start, why don't you give listeners a short bio about yourself?
Sure. So, as most people going into college, I went down on the path of marine biology and then found out that wasn't what I wanted to do and wound up in the Navy, flew electronic countermeasures missions for a number of years, ironically in the theater of question right now that we all focus on. Then after leaving that, worked for AT&T Global for quite a number of years, building networking around the world. Finished up my career as a federal consultant, actually working with you, Lou, and a range of others across the federal landscape. And during that entire time, over a couple decades now, you and I have talked consistently about where this country was heading, what it needed in order to be its best self. And, I guess that's what we're going to talk about a little bit today.
It is. And, and then the pandemic heightened some of that dialogue, as we both know. And we've talked about it as we are now directly. We've talked about it through Facebook and posts. And we've talked about the extreme voices in politics and how they're overwhelming or drowning out those who aren't extreme. So one of the things that I know you've been thinking about is, where's the center? What's going on in the center? We don't think that, we both agree, the country's not as extreme as the voices make it seem. Those extremes are out there, but there's people in the middle, maybe more like us, who don't hold those extreme views. And we both wondered, we're part of that. What's going on with that center, and where's the voice or the message coming from the center? So why don't you just pick up on that and share your thoughts on it?
Sure. Well, what's of interest to me in focus on this is, hypocrisy is in vogue right now. And I think it has been for a long time, but it's come to the forefront today. Rather than having constructive dialogue, we are busy hurling insults at one another. Your position's wrong, and if you don't accept mine, I'm not going to listen to you anymore. Well, that's a recipe for disaster, especially in the 21st century, where things happen very quickly and the implications are much broader and deeper than they perhaps were 100, 200 years ago. The fact is that the Republicans say the Democrats spend too much money, for instance. The Democrats can say, no, the Republicans are just like us. They get it off. They spend too much money. The reality is both are true. If you look at the situation,
too much money, period.
We are. And again, the priorities differ. If you get a Republican administration in right now, the focus becomes the travesty of abortion. If you get the Democratic side in, then the travesty becomes homelessness, et cetera, et cetera. And rather than talking constructively as intelligent humans about how we can address these problems, both factually and economically, which is important, we tend to just hurl insults at each other. And today, I looked yesterday again, and we had crossed the $30.3 trillion mark for national debt. Now, most people don't know that national debt is just the discretionary debt. There's a whole lot more non-discretionary debt, like Social Security and stuff, that are hanging out there that don't even get incorporated into that money. But $30.3 trillion, you say that to people, and they either don't connect with you or their eyes glaze over, because you can't wrap your mind around some of this.
It's mind-boggling.
It's 14 digits long.
Yeah.
So there's a lot there. But what's more important to that, and I wish the American public would pay more attention to this in their busy lives, but what's more important than that number is the debt in relationship to our gross domestic product, how much we produce as a nation. In 1980, the ratio of our national debt to our GDP, or gross domestic product, was 34.5%. Today, it is 125.6%.
Yeah.
That means that we're spending over 25 cents over and above every dollar, that just goes right to that debt line. And then administrations on both sides want to talk about deficit. They don't ever want to talk about debt. They want to talk about, I'm going to reduce the deficit. And people don't stop to realize that what they're basically saying in layman's terms is, I'm going into debt less fast than I was yesterday, or more fast, faster or less fast. The fundamentals of saying we are still digging the hole. We're not even stopping the dig, much less filling in the hole. We keep digging it deeper on both sides of the equation.
The article I read yesterday talked about the fact that the rules of the game have become things that support the continuation of what you just decried, which is if our side wins, that's what matters. Is that we just want to win. We want more seats so we can we'll pass or attempt to pass the legislation we think is that we have a mandate for. And the winner take all system is a little bit weird because if you win 51% and you want to claim you have a mandate, you got to be a little careful with that. There
Right.
might have been 49% of the people who thought some things could go a different way. And as you're saying, and as what we're both saying is, if you have the right kind of dialogue about it, you can find in the middle where most people think is the reasonable path. But if you say at 51% you have a mandate and you go in and do things that are extreme or your hot button issues, that's what the game's become. It's self-fulfilling in that sense that it's like a political masturbation, Dan. Like that makes me feel good, and I'm just going
Hmm.
to do it. I'm going to
Sure.
keep doing it. And then you won last time. Well, now you're going to do it. Well, what are we getting out of that as a country? What's the policy decisions? What's the course we're on? We've got big problems. Nothing's changing while the
Well,
parties do that.
I think you have to start with an educated public. And even that term, education, can spawn
Woo.
hours of debate right now, right? But the fact is, Lou, if you or I were to line up 10 people on the street right now and ask them who their congressional representatives were, maybe one or two might tell you. And the other eight would say, I'm not real sure, as they haven't paid enough attention. And then of the, say, two, they could name them. You ask them, well, what do they stand for? And all you're going to get is a deer in the headlights look, because granted, people's lives are busy.
Yeah.
But I think the establishment machine, fertilizes that air of
Yep.
busyness such that the individual does not have time in their lives to think about things that matter to them. The hypocrisy then just pervades from that because people seize on little sound bites in the media, social or online or
Mm-hmm.
broadcast, and then that becomes their mantra for the day. And rather than having an intelligent discussion about a subject, we devolve into hurling insults at one another based on a very small fraction of the information that actually surrounds the subject at hand. And to your point about a 51 or even a 55% win, people say, oh, I won by 5 points. That's great. Yes, but only 30% of the eligible voters actually cast their vote.
Yeah, right. That's
There's
true too.
another problem,
That's
right?
true too.
You
Yeah,
know,
yeah.
so what happens if a different 30% woke up that morning and said, I think I'm going to vote? Then the whole spectrum could change, right? So we have to, as a society, start to take ownership at an individual level of our future. And that's the last thing that the establishment, government, congressional representatives want to
I agree.
happen.
I agree.
There's a
I
reason
agree.
that if you look at the congressional landscape, the vast majority of them are multi-term, some of them multi-decade politicians. And our forefathers never meant for politics at a congressional level to be a career.
Yeah.
It was something you were supposed to put aside your professional career for a limited amount of time and
As a
go in
service.
and as a service to the nation, right? But and I mean we, the individual American, need to take ownership of that because we've allowed this to happen over the recent 2, 3, 4 decades. We have turned a blind eye to what Congress was doing, and they have, like humans will do, granted themselves raises, granted themselves health care that we don't, as American citizens, have. It's quite an interesting contradiction to me that the Congress that is responsible for quality, affordable health care in America doesn't even use the same quality, affordable health
No,
care
not
that
at
they
all.
grant to the citizens.
Not at
They
all.
have created their own parallel platform that covers them and their families, not only while they're in office, but for the rest of their lives, while we sit out here and grouse back and forth about the cost of health insurance. That is a perfect example of how Americans need to pay more attention to the details in their
It's
lives.
a good point. I think there's some limitation on that, but the points that doesn't change your point. It's a very self-serving, and we talked about that over the course of the pandemic as people were ranting and raving about the vaccine, and I made a comment on a Facebook post. I said, look, the only people that are benefiting by, it became a very vitriolic dialogue at that time. I
Mm-hmm.
said, the only people who are benefiting by this are the ones who want to get elected on it,
Yeah.
and the ones who make money at it in some other way. So if you are a podcaster, if you're a broadcaster, if you're a commentator and you've got your shtick and you make money, you get eyeballs on your posts on your blogs, or you get people viewing you on TV or listening to you on radio, or if you are in an industry where you can make a ton of money based on the divisiveness. The divisiveness works for you.
Hmm.
There's certain parties that are doing very well with things being that divisive, and it's not the country. It's not the people in the middle who are maybe I don't even know if it's a political middle, but who aren't extreme, who are saying, can we get back to talking about our infrastructure? Is it time to update our clean water and our clean air laws because it's been decades since they were written? It's those parties that benefit by it that keep perpetuating it. Let's talk a little bit about how to reclaim the dialogue. Let's talk a bit about your experience talking to people. You mentioned if you actually talk to people and don't open up with, firing my opinions at somebody, that's the opening salvo,
Right.
right? I'm going to shoot
Right.
my opinions at you. If we actually talk to people, what do you hear in the dialogue when you're talking to? We both live in Florida. I'm in Tampa. You're in a less, say, urban area.
Right. Right.
What do you hear,
Well,
people?
to begin with, I think we when we become focused in this area, it becomes obvious that in the current environment, there's not a crisis out there that cannot be monetized,
Mm-hmm.
and or used as an emotional stir stick among the population. Right? Take the pandemic. Oh, Fauci's an ass. No, no, Fauci's the science. No, Fauci's that. Blah blah blah. And what you want to do, you devolve into this discussion, if you will, a very dated discussion about an individual that at the end of the day has nothing to do with the original subject at hand. Take what we're dealing with right now in Ukraine. Well, Putin's a jerk. Well, no, the West is trying to be a capital, blah, blah, blah. Instead of talking about the human suffering and the travesty that is going on, the human cost of what's happening there, we are devolving into who's going to provide what weapons to whom, when, and what's that going to result in. Wow. The end result is not going to be good either way. So what do I hear? Look, in Florida, take Florida just yesterday, as I understand it, there's a new law that the legislature came out with that the left side has dubbed the Don't Say Gay law.
Right.
If you dig into it, though, what it really says is don't talk about things like transgender sexuality, as an example, to children that are 4, 5, 6, 8 years old. And when you look at it from that perspective, our children today have an ever shorter childhood because of the things that are going on all around them. Those few years of innocence should be preserved. They should be focusing on teddy bears and who's kicking the can out of the street and riding bikes, and then things like that. There will come a time, the vast majority of all of our lives, where we have to focus on things we're talking about today. But when you're 7 or 8 years old, not only should you not be faced with that, you don't have the mental maturity to process it and make it make sense in your world. So, neither side is right and neither side is wrong there when they start talking about that one piece of legislation. Should we embrace, humanity regardless of sexual orientation, yada, yada, yada? Absolutely. Can we pick a fight amongst ourselves about any one of the issues related to that
Yeah,
humanity?
absolutely.
Sure. So the focus now becomes the fight rather than the humanity, right? Why
True,
are we doing
true,
this?
true. But let's talk about that for a minute. Try to illustrate the point you're making. I saw that article yesterday and want to look up the law to actually read the language. Two things concern me. One, I think if you just think about the objective of it, okay, it's not unreasonable. Let's not have the subject matter in the curriculum from kindergarten to
Right.
third grade. But Anne's a school teacher, and she says, well, it's not in the curriculum. There's no curriculum in which that's a part. I said, well, how would it come up in a classroom? She said, at those ages, probably wouldn't. She said, a teacher's not going to bring it up because they don't want to open that can of worms in a classroom.
Right.
They're not using it as part of any curriculum at those ages, and they're not going to read a book at reading time that gets into that issue because any individual could, but she said generally teachers aren't going to because it opens all kinds of conversations that you don't even want to have.
Right.
So a student could bring it up, she said. She said there's a student where she teaches who's got, I think she said he had like black fingernail, painted his fingernails pink or black and blink sparkles. So kids are saying, what is that about? So I said, well, what's the conversation that teachers try to have? And she says, only way to play it is tolerance. Right.
Right.
The only way to do it if you're a teacher is to not, no matter what your personal view is, you shouldn't espouse a political or a social policy sort of position on it. It's just, you got to just teach tolerance. Now, maybe parents think there should be a harsher judgment made about that student. That's their opinion. But as a teacher in a classroom, all you can say is, we respect each other, we treat each other well, let's move on with the lesson, right? That's what you're going to
Right.
try to do. What concerned me about the language that was quoted in articles, I want to read it because you always find something that you read it, the original, that wasn't covered in the
Uh-huh.
press coverage,
Right.
was how vague some of the language was. And they're saying parents ought to be able to sue. So what I saw in it more, if what you want to grant the legislature, especially the Republicans, because it was their bill, is a value of we don't think this should be in the classroom at those 3 grades, 4 grades. Okay, I can agree with that. But if you look at the means to the end, how they constructed the language, the legislation, there could be something else going on here. This is
Hmm.
kind of poking. This is the political. This is saying to people, go ahead and sue. Well, that's not a public policy objective that I think is valuable for education. So pick it up. What are your thoughts on how something like that helps or distorts the conversation we need to be having about an issue?
Well, the first thing that comes to mind, just in a bigger picture format, is the litigious culture that we have developed here in the United States. It doesn't matter who you are, what you stand for, there's somebody to sue about it. And as a result, everything goes up. The cost of food, the cost of healthcare, the cost of insurance, everything goes up, not because of real issues. I think to your point, this is a piece of legislation. Just use it as an example, not champion or otherwise. It's just an example where a set of individuals crafted a law that on one hand could be very well meaning, on the other hand could have underlying
Unintended, right?
implications,
Right,
right?
right.
But they were allowed to craft that law almost in a vacuum because the public that they serve knows, again, just enough about it to be dangerous. So you have the left-leaning side of America saying, oh, we're going to call this don't say gay. Well, that's inflammatory, okay, because
Right.
that's not really true. On the other hand, the right side will say, well, we're just protecting children and their innocence. Well, okay, but it goes beyond that, or could go beyond that. And then the simplest view would be, okay, if we're having a dialogue about this, A, we could probably craft a much better piece of legislation, and B, does it really matter to begin with if we're doing the right things for the right reasons? And I really think we've got to get back to ownership as individual citizens of our collective future, because right now we are voting on individuals, as we said before, that we put into office and then turn a blind eye to for 2 or 4 years or perhaps more, because we've got better things to do. But then when a piece of legislation gets enacted
Then we
that
then we pay
crosses,
attention to it. Yeah.
it crosses our personal boundary, and we're like, oh my God, how did that happen? Well, how it happened was you were asleep at the wheel, Mr. Citizen.
Another thing I read from a Republican was fair point. He was saying, parents, I encourage you to take this up at home. So let's not
Hmm.
put it in the schools. Take
Right,
take this up at home. But I think that makes me think of the point you just made, which is some families do, a lot of families don't.
right,
A lot of
right.
families don't. And you read the legislation, or you heard about the proposed legislation. I don't think anything's passed. They wanted to criminalize, no, that wanted teachers to report to parents if a student approached them and said there's homes all over this district where students of any age can't talk to their parents about these things. And sometimes the only trusted person they know is perhaps a teacher. And there's always that one teacher, that one coach you think, I could tell something to, I could confide
Right.
in.
Sure.
And so she's saying, you want to make it a law that they've got to report that?
Right.
So I still respect the objective. I think this is a means end. I think this comes down to a means ends challenge, Dan.
Right.
I respect the end. I respect the objective of let's put the right conversations in the right places for people who ought to be having them. The means to the end, as I've seen it in the Florida law, is probably more problematic than helpful. Maybe in the end, it's with lawsuits and things, it's going to be more of a problem than a help.
Sure.
But I won't condemn the objective.
Right.
But you and I having a conversation about it that who else had? Did they have this conversation in the legislature? I kind of
Sure.
doubt it.
Nope.
I
Yeah,
had,
you can be sure not.
recently I interviewed Susan Valdez, my Florida State rep.
Uh-huh.
A month or two ago, we had the episode, and she said she's a Democrat, pretty centrist in her approach, though, which I liked. More like, look, it's just kind of like what you and I did in business, problem-solving approach.
Right.
We didn't have to have a big philosophy or theory about. We were trying to solve problems every day, and she's got that problem-solving approach. And she said to me, without naming any names, she said, I asked a Republican colleague, why are you doing that? And that wasn't in reference to anything that I knew, and this is months
Right.
ago. He said, because we can.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, because we're allowed to. Mm-hmm.
And part of it is because they've got the numbers. Part of it is because they both sides have rigged the rules to work for them when they need the rules to work for them, right?
Right.
And then part of it's because of what you've already said, which is watchdog groups are fine, but where's the citizens watching this going, no, 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 that's not, I can't agree to that. That's not right. Back off of
Right.
that. Rethink
Right.
that. Keep talking about that. You're not stopping here. Keep thinking about that and talking about it and make that better.
Mm-hmm. Back when I first began studying the management side over the engineering side, as I moved through my own profession, you know, I've talked about this. I think I had a seminar from a gentleman named Peter Singay, who headed the Sloan School of Management at MIT. And, you know, what he said was, you know, we're basically, as individual humans, only unprejudiced for the first second of life. But as soon as that doctor smacks you on the butt, you become developing prejudices. Ow, that hurt. I don't want to do that again. And it goes on from there. And so we evolve into adulthood, developing our own, you know, focal points, you know, emotional, you know, perspectives, et cetera, et cetera. But those things are all formed or should be formed in large part by a rich dialogue of exploring perspectives. You know, getting back to your teacher, I'm sure the first thing he says is, like, I have time to do that with this administrative overload that I have today. Well, where did that administrative overload come from? In large part, it came from, well, we've got to protect our hindquarters so that it's not possible that this district or I get sued for what I say or do or don't do. You know, Lou, I remember back in high school, you know, elementary school, high school, teachers that if they had a problem student would actually take the time out of their lives to go visit the parents at their home and say, hey, this is what I'm seeing. You know, you always had the
Not
parent-teacher
anymore.
conferences, but, you know, they would take time out of their lives to go and have a discussion about an issue and try and nip it in the bud. Not only do they not have time to do that anymore, they couldn't do it. I'm sure there's an administrative rule that says they can't do it because A, they might open a can of worms for the district, and B, they might walk into a situation where they get shot or kidnapped or God knows what else. And that's a sad statement about a much bigger picture, the education of our societal fabric, you know?
Yeah, those stories were sort of legendary. That teacher, that coach who
Sure.
working with the family to see if they could help with something. And yeah, I can imagine someone doing that today. It's a different environment, much riskier.
Right.
I can
Right. And it all
imagine.
boils down to risk, you know, financial, emotional, physical risk involved in expressing oneself, be you a teacher or just Joe, the average American citizen. You have to be very careful about what you say to not find yourself on the rails, you know, in society. And that's an unfortunate factor that keeps us from dialogue. And that was the other thing Singay said is there's a fundamental difference between dialogue and discussion. When people discuss an issue, they come at it from, this is my perspective and this is why it's right. And you need to accept it. In a dialogue, a true dialogue, you come to the table, you throw all of your perspectives on the table, and then you dissect them together and come out with a core set of perspectives that are well-rounded because of the different inputs that came to the table.
Mm-hmm.
We don't do that anymore. We just hurl insults at one another, you know?
Do you remember? Do you remember the stories? Do you know the name Daryl Davis? He's a
The name
musician.
sounds familiar.
He's a like a. I'm looking at his website, blues, a boogie woogie, blues rock and roll. He's probably our age. He's been around a long time, but he's the guy, you've probably heard the stories. He's a black man who befriended KKK members decades ago. He was playing and he's on a break between sets, and he strikes up a conversation with a white guy there who turns out to be a KKK member at the time.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
But the way that Daryl handled the conversation didn't inflame anything. Now, he's operating at a handicap from the start,
Right.
but didn't inflame anything. And the way he interacted with the guy made the guy think, I like this guy. I like this guy. And they struck up a friendship. And when he would go back to that town, they would meet. Well, and then over time, he met more and more guys. And the famous part of the story is he's got, I don't know, a dozen or two KKK outfits in his possession. The guys gave him and said, I'm done. White guys giving
Right.
him the cloak
Mm-hmm.
and the hood saying, you know, I'm walking away from that. In part because of the relationship they had or came to have with him over time. And he talks about in his speeches how he listened,
Right.
how he interacted with them. That was part of what I think we could use today when, like you said, not opening up with your opinion about something, but in the dialogue, listening. Not that you don't have a view and not that you shouldn't express it,
Mm-hmm.
but there's got to be this way we do it so that we're trying to achieve a greater objective than just we're skins and shirts teams, and I'm trying to advance my team and you're trying to advance yours. Fuck
Right.
that. What kind of objective is that anymore?
Exactly. Exactly. As I age, you look back at things you heard, truisms, and one of the ones that my mom used to say to me all the time, which she probably should have listened to herself more, was that God gave you two ears and one mouth for a reason. And basically, that's a simplistic way of saying, if the input you're receiving is not at least twice the output you're giving, we're probably on a wrong path, right? Because when I was in charge of adult education at Cable and Wireless, and we were running seminars across the nation about moving to the digital age, and one of the things that I would always open with as an icebreaker is, what I know about this subject is a small fraction of what I want to know about this subject. What I want to know about this subject is an even smaller fraction of what there is to know about this subject.
That's a good point.
And what that means is you keep yourself open to learning. Because if you stop for 5 minutes, what you were talking about 5 minutes ago has changed, especially in the digital world that we live in today, right? So we have to constantly open ourselves up to input, to refine our own perspectives and come together again in that dialogue-centric focus for national and personal prosperity. And we're not doing that because A, our lives are very, very busy, and B, the powers that be and the control factors that come from that don't want us talking at that level.
Well, that's true. But let's talk about the psychology of that. There's something comforting, or certainty feels comforting, certainty feels good, certainty feels safe. This is the psychology of it. And the idea of learning almost means, could feel to some people like, well, is everything relativistic? Is there's always more to learn? It can feel unmoored, unanchored, unstable. I love what you said. I live that way. I don't find it disturbing or troubling. I like to take in new information, and I don't worry about if it challenges something I was already thinking.
Right.
Because I could just adjust what I'm already thinking and line it up with new information, because I'm always thinking about the larger principle. If it's in business or if it's in a relationship, right? There's a larger principle that I want to aspire to, that I want to honor, and everything else is a means to the end.
Right.
And if I learn new things about the means or about myself, if I learn something about myself that I didn't know I sounded that way or came across that way, or okay, that's not my intent, because my goal is to have the communication be clear, be productive, be respectful. So I change the means.
Sure.
Because to me, the end. So just go ahead and react to that.
Well, to begin with, when we start to have discussions, with individuals in society, family, friends, or just people you just met on the street, and you start to espouse your position about a given subject, the impetus today is for the other person to interrupt you and not let you finish your thought, because if you finish your thoughts, you might actually make a point, So rather than let you finish what you're saying, interrupt you and start with your own. And,
Shut you
and at
down, yeah.
that point, dialogue stops, right? Because now you become that polarized, interaction. I don't know how we get past that, but I think from my own past, getting back to what we've talked about, prejudices and how they continue to pervade our current and future. When I was 19 years old, one of my best friends, was shot to death in the parking lot. My best friend was black. I'm a white American. He was shot to death by a white supremacist that in his own mind and his own prejudices thought that there might be a possibility that this individual could do something wrong. And the end result was horrific for both, Harold's family, for me as an individual. And the worst part of it for me, beyond watching my best friend die, right there, was a couple of weeks later having to stand up in front of a large population of his family and friends as a white American and explain to them why we're not all bad, and how color should not define us. People always want to go back to that famous quote from Martin Luther King about the character of oneself rather than the color of their skin, right? And we talk about that like it's some epiphany. Well, let's sit down and really think about that and then try and practice it. But it never happens because we are, again, so polarized and so busy that we don't have time to learn from one another. And somehow we've got to change that, because we can see the results clearly all around us right now from not being a dialogue centrist, forward-focused centrist populist. If you're not a Democrat, you're wrong. If you're not a Republican, well, you're wrong.
Yeah,
if you're a libertarian, you're just cuckoo, right? So at the end of the day, we can say, okay, that was fun, but what did we really do, right?
I wonder if, so you're at an airport, you're at the gate, you're just talking to somebody you don't even know, never met him before, maybe never see him again, and this conversation comes up, which could be divisive. And if you just approached it differently and asked more questions than offered more opinions. I've done this in different settings. You can see the conversation go in a different direction. You can see it unfold in a different way than if you're tossing opinions at each other. I know you for 20 years, you've been preaching dialogue, whether it was about politics or a project team.
Right.
What's your experience when you saw the conversation? You knew it could go in an unproductive way, and you saw by how you listened or others asked questions, it shifted. That concludes the first of 2 episodes Dan and I recorded. Join us next week for more on putting aside what Dan called individual control factors for honest and open dialogue, the need for dialogue about long-term solutions, not just what the left or right want today, and ways to shift our thinking and perspectives in order to open up dialogue we need for the long run.